Hello everyone, welcome back to History 1152. In this video, we will discuss America in the 1960s. The 1960s was a time of massive political and social change in the United States. We will discuss some of the people and events that initiated these massive transformations. The 1960s began with a presidential election. This election saw Richard Nixon, the incumbent vice president, run against John Fitzgerald Kennedy, a Democrat from Massachusetts. Nixon, a Republican from California, had served in the administration of the popular and generally well-liked President Dwight D. Eisenhower. Ike even campaigned for Nixon in the final days of the election. Nixon ran on the experience he had gained working in the Eisenhower administration, and he also campaigned on the promise of continuing many of Eisenhower's policies. In his campaign, Kennedy argued that the Eisenhower admin, and by proxy Nixon, had not done enough to help America fight the Cold War. He pointed to the U.S. lagging behind the Soviet Union in the space race. The Soviets had launched the first satellite, Sputnik, back in 1957, and the Soviets had also put the first man, Yuri Gagarin, into orbit in 1961 as well, demonstrating the lead they had in the space race. Eisenhower had founded NASA, but Kennedy argued that new leadership was necessary to help America gain the lead in the space race. Kennedy also argued that the U.S. was falling behind the Soviets militarily as well, noting a perceived missile gap between the U.S. and the USSR. Kennedy promised to remedy this if he were elected. Kennedy also did a better job reaching African Americans than Nixon did. The Democratic Party had begun to attract black voters back in the 1930s using the New Deal, but Kennedy spoke to African Americans' fight for civil rights, condemning the arrest and jailing of African American civil rights activist Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in Georgia. Nixon had privately called for King's release, but he never made his arrest a major issue for his campaign. Nixon was able to attack Kennedy for being Catholic as well, playing into the anti-Catholic feelings that many Protestants still had. Nixon also attacked Kennedy for his age and supposed lack of experience. Kennedy was 43, while Nixon himself was 47. A key moment in the 1960 presidential election took place during the first presidential debate. The 1960 election was the first presidential electoral contest to host televised debates. Kennedy worked hard to curate his television image. He had nice hair and tan skin, and generally looked good for the camera. Supporters of Kennedy connected his rugged and masculine appearance to his military service in World War II, even though Nixon had served as well. Nixon, in contrast, did not look as handsome. During the first debate, Nixon did not wear television makeup, and looked tired, nervous, and unkempt. His hair was disheveled, and sweat and a clear 5 o'clock shadow could be seen on his face. Kennedy clearly won the first debate, although Nixon did better in the second and third debates, which he arguably won because he had better prepared his image. Nixon also made some critical mistakes in his campaign strategy, promising to visit all 50 states, while Kennedy preferred to focus on the swing states, a strategy favored by modern presidential candidates. Nixon did not craft an image for himself, and he stretched his campaign too thin. Kennedy won in what was one of the closest elections in U.S. history. Key to his victory were the states of Texas and Illinois. Many white Texans were skeptical of Kennedy, a Massachusetts Yankee and a Catholic, but Kennedy's running mate, Lyndon B. Johnson, helped to bring the Lone Star State for the Democrats. Kennedy also won Illinois, thanks in part to winning the city of Chicago. There were reports of voter fraud in both states, and that organized crime groups helped Kennedy win in Illinois, although scholars have debated these issues for years. Kennedy won 49.7% of the popular vote, compared to Nixon's 49.6%. He received 303 delegates, even though the Southern Democrat Harry Byrd took electoral votes away from Kennedy in the Deep South. Once he was elected, Kennedy kept his promise of strengthening the U.S. military and taking a more confrontational approach with the Soviet Union. He responded aggressively to the speeches of Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev, and he called for increased defense spending, adding over $3.25 billion US dollars to the defense budget, about $28 billion in today's money. He also planned to increase the number of troops in the U.S. military, and he sent more Special Forces combat advisors to South Vietnam. The advisors, which had been in Vietnam since the Eisenhower years, were there to train South Vietnamese troops to fight against communist North Vietnam, but also against communist insurgents within Vietnam, the Viet Cong. Vietnam had been partitioned at the 17th parallel after the Viet Minh insurgency under Ho Chi Minh had defeated the last French colonial forces in Indochina in 1954, and the U.S. worked to prevent communist North Vietnam's takeover of the South, as it had on the Korean Peninsula during the Korean War. Kennedy also approved the Bay of Pigs invasion, in which CIA-trained Cuban exiles would invade Cuba and attempt to begin insurrection against Fidel Castro, leader of the communist Cuban government, who had ruled the country since 1958. About 1,500 Cuban exiles, codenamed Operation 40, landed at the Bay of Pigs on April 17, 1961, and while they had initial successes, began to lose the initiative. Fearing that the U.S. would be linked to the invasion, Kennedy withheld air support, and the exiles were defeated and taken prisoner by Castro and treated harshly during their imprisonment. The failed invasion and insurrection shook Kennedy's confidence and damaged his image, leading Khrushchev to order the construction of the Berlin Wall to prevent East Germans from escaping to Allied West Berlin. Kennedy would have another confrontation over Cuba in 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis. In response to the failed Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961, and the U.S. placing Jupiter missiles in Turkey and Italy, North Atlantic Treaty Organization NATO allies, the Soviet Union planned to send nuclear ballistic missiles to Cuba. Cuba is a mere 90 miles from the southernmost point of Florida, and the missiles would have been able to strike targets on the East Coast, including Washington, D.C. There were already missiles in Cuba, but the arrival of more angered many Americans, who called for Kennedy to keep his campaign promise of getting tough with the Soviets. Kennedy wanted to confront the USSR, but he also did not want to start a nuclear war. Consequently, Kennedy and his cabinet decided to initiate a naval blockade of Cuba and prevent the Soviets from delivering the bombs. After a near 2-week standoff between the U.S. and the Soviet navies, the U.S. and the USSR reached an agreement. Khrushchev ordered that the missiles be returned to the Soviet Union, and both Kennedy and Khrushchev agreed to dismantle existing missile installations in Cuba and Turkey. The Cuban Missile Crisis is generally considered the event that was most likely to start a nuclear war between the U.S. and the USSR. Kennedy's prestige increased during the Cuban Missile Crisis because of his handling of the Soviets, and the general feeling was the U.S. got the better end of the deal. On the foreign policy front, Kennedy is considered to have been a fairly successful, or at least neutral, president. Domestically speaking, Kennedy presided over a rapidly changing American home front. The biggest changes that would come to American society during the Kennedy years would develop because of the movement for African American civil rights. As you know from previous videos, African Americans had faced severe racial discrimination across the country, even after the end of slavery. Black people had been barred from voting in the southern states and had to live under the Jim Crow laws, which mandated segregation and black inferiority. In addition, black people who appeared to step out of line often faced violence from white armed groups like the Ku Klux Klan. Many black people were killed by white vigilante groups in lynchings. Discrimination, especially in housing, was common outside of the South as well. Black people had fought for equality under the law for years, and they tried to demonstrate that they were equal to whites. Black people pursued education, built businesses, and served in the military to show their equality. While many white Americans supported black equality, many were opposed to civil rights legislation and supported segregation as well. Kennedy supported the civil rights movement, but was very cautious in his support for fear of alienating white Southerners, who were an important part of the Democratic Party's coalition and very hostile to black equality, which would threaten the Jim Crow system that controlled Southern life. African American leaders had fought for civil rights for decades, but their movement gained ground in the 1950s and 1960s. African American veterans demonstrated the patriotism and equality of black people, and U.S. government policymakers were concerned that racial discrimination reflected badly on the U.S., and that it would give ideological ammunition to the Soviets, who would use racial tension to weaken the country. The Soviet government ran media campaigns against racial discrimination in the U.S. and invited African American artists and musicians to visit the USSR. The Soviets may also have used these campaigns to distract from racial discrimination and human rights abuses within their own borders. How did African Americans fight for civil rights? Everyday African Americans looked to leaders within their communities, while also trying to resist injustices in their own day-to-day lives as well. The activism of black leaders and everyday African Americans led several landmark court cases to be made. One of the most important early cases was Brown versus Board of Education in 1954, which declared segregated schools unconstitutional. We talked about the Little Rock Nine of 1957 and the immediate effects of this case in our last video. Brown v. Board helped to inspire other cases against segregation in both public spaces and private businesses. On the ground, civil rights activists staged nonviolent protests called sit-ins, in which black and white activists would sit in at segregated businesses and buildings until they were arrested by the police. At the same time, the murder of Emmett Till, a 14-year-old African-American male from Chicago who was visiting family in Mississippi, drew national attention to the plight of black Americans. Till had been murdered in 1955 after an encounter with a white woman in a store, although the exact details of what happened have been debated, and the woman changed her account of what happened years later. Whatever transpired, Till had apparently violated the Jim Crow caste system and was kidnapped, beaten, and murdered by the woman's husband and relatives, who thought that Till had violated the white supremacist system that governed Southern life. Till's mutilated and decomposed corpse was found 3 days after his death. Till's mother, Mamie, insisted that her son's funeral be both public and open casket, so that the nation could see what had happened to her son. The murder of Till caused national outrage, with African American leaders from the NAACP condemning the murder and calling for the arrest and trial of the men responsible for Till's death. Many whites, even white supremacists, condemned the murder, but believed that Till was responsible for his own death because he had violated Jim Crow norms. The defendants were acquitted by an all-white jury, and people of all races believed that they should have been found guilty. Till's death helped to inspire a new generation of African American activists, including Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King Jr., whom we talked about before. Parks' story ended much more positively than Till's. In December of 1955, Rosa Parks, a middle-aged African-American woman in Montgomery, Alabama, refused to give up her seat to a white passenger on a public bus in the city. Montgomery's buses were segregated, with black and white sections. But if the white section was full, then black riders were expected to give up their seats to whites and stand. Parks, in defiance of Jim Crow, refused to give up her seat and was arrested. Her arrest prompted the mass boycott of public transportation in Montgomery. With the support of the NAACP, her activism led to the desegregation of public buses, paving the way for the desegregation of public places in the South. Parks' protests also inspired the Freedom Riders of 1961, who called for the desegregation of interstate buses, following in Parks' footsteps. Martin Luther King Jr., who had been a friend of Parks, founded the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC, in 1957. King, a Christian minister from Georgia, had worked with Rosa Parks and had studied the nonviolent protest and civil disobedience tactics of Mahatma Gandhi, whose work had led to India becoming independent from Great Britain. King believed that nonviolent protest would be far more effective in the fight for African American civil rights, believing that peaceful, direct action would be more likely to get whites to support the African American cause. King initially focused on desegregating the city of Albany, Georgia. The movement in Albany was unsuccessful, with King being arrested and jailed. After Albany, King and the SCLC focused their efforts on Birmingham, Alabama, in 1963. King and the SCLC planned marches and sit-ins, working with local African Americans while also attracting activists from across the country. In Birmingham, King was counting on the protesters being arrested, led by the city's police commissioner, Eugene Bull Connor, an aggressive segregationist who would make the arrests. The protests marched in Birmingham, and the police tried to break up the marches, often using violence. Some of the protesters were violent, but most were peaceful, and most of the violence came from the police, who beat the protesters, released attack dogs on them, and even squirted some of them with high-powered water hoses. King, while he was in jail, penned his famous Letter from Birmingham Jail, in which he outlined the moral case for desegregation and black civil rights. King's protest in Birmingham was successful. It began the process of desegregation in Birmingham and gained national media attention for the civil rights movement. In August of 1963, King, the SCLC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Commission, SNCC or SNCC, and other civil rights and workers' organizations organized the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. The marchers were demonstrating for African American civil rights, but also for an increase in the minimum wage. It is estimated that as many as 250,000 people showed up for the march and the rallies. The coalition of marchers was both racially and ethnically diverse, and the march was not focused exclusively on black civil rights, but on the plight of poor people of all races. King, in his famous "I Have a Dream" speech on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, called for racial harmony through equal rights. The march, and King's speech with its unifying message, was a resounding success and helped to inspire the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. While the March on Washington was generally a unifying event, many still criticized it, including more militant African American leaders, like Malcolm X, a leader in the Nation of Islam movement. The FBI also began to tap King's telephones after the march as well. King continued his activism after the march, leading nonviolent protests in Selma, Alabama, including a march from Selma to Montgomery in 1965 to call for enforcement of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and to advocate for additional legislation to protect African American voting rights. SNCC activists had worked to register black people to vote outside of Selma, but had been harassed by the Selma sheriff. Local law enforcement had also killed a black person as well. King, the SCLC, and SNCC planned a march to draw attention to these abuses. The marchers were initially attacked by the police and counter-protesters. The protesters offered passive resistance, and the media coverage allowed everyday Americans across the country to see the violence of the segregationists and the supporters of Jim Crow, leading to a groundswell of support for African American civil rights. The March from Selma also helped to inspire the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which protected the voting rights for Americans of all races. After 1965, King and his supporters continued to demonstrate for African American civil rights and other issues as well. King extended his focus to the North and fought for housing rights for African Americans in cities like Chicago. King also began to criticize the U.S. as a whole more, condemning the country for the ongoing war in Vietnam, which had escalated in 1964. King also condemned the country for the deep poverty in which many Americans, especially minorities, suffered. Other civil rights groups also became more militant. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Commission, SNCC, dropped its commitment to nonviolence and expelled its white members, aligning itself with the emerging Black Power movement. The young Black Power activists believed that civil rights for African Americans was not enough, and that the Black freedom struggle would not be complete until what they saw as systemic and institutional racism in American society, from police brutality against black people as seen during the Watts riots in LA in 1965, and other cities in 1967 and 1968, along with disproportionate levels of poverty that black people experienced, had been remedied. The Black Power movement was ideologically diverse and included many older activists from the civil rights movement, like Rosa Parks, along with younger, more militant activists like Stokely Carmichael, who advocated for black separatism. Many in the movement believed that desegregation was not a worthwhile goal in a society they regarded as racist. Many Black Power advocates rejected the pacifist Christianity and nonviolent stances of King in favor of creating an armed insurgency against what they saw as a racist white culture in society. The assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. in 1968 strengthened the call to abandon the nonviolent tactics of older groups, like the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. An important organization within the Black Power movement was the Black Panther Party. The Black Panther Party, BPP, was founded in 1966 by Huey Newton in Oakland, California, as a black insurgent and revolutionary Marxist organization. While King had worked to dissociate himself from communists, the Black Panthers considered communist regimes to be allies in their struggle against the U.S., which they saw as a racist imperialist power that oppressed people of color both at home and abroad. The Panthers supported defense of the black community against police brutality and got into shootouts with law enforcement. They also utilized nonviolent community activism, offering charitable assistance to inner-city blacks. The Black Panthers initially supported black nationalism, but minimized this stance over time, with the hope of allying with other radical left-wing movements in the U.S. and other parts of the world. Supporters of the Panthers saw the movement as a revolutionary insurgency, while opponents saw them as a gang. The Black Panthers would reach the zenith of their power in 1970, but the organization began to collapse after that due to assassinations and infiltration by the FBI, but also personal infighting within the group. The Panthers would have a resurgence in the late 1980s, but groups like the Southern Poverty Law Center and the Anti-Defamation League, even some of the original Panthers, condemned the new BPP. While the Black Panthers began to collapse as a group at the end of the 1960s, the larger Black Power movement would continue on, although it failed to gain the kind of support from non-Black people that the earlier and more moderate civil rights movement had enjoyed. As you can see, African American activism changed over time. In the 1950s and early 1960s, its members advocated for equality under the law and an end to legal segregation and Jim Crow, using nonviolent direct action. The civil rights activists believed that to succeed, they needed to appear to be peaceful, to gain support from white Americans. Their movement, in spite of the fierce resistance they received, was largely successful, inspiring the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and other cases, like Loving v. Virginia in 1967, which struck down laws banning interracial marriage. The civil rights movement leaders, like MLK, represented their movement as peaceful, organized, and patriotic. Over time, though, African American activists adopted a more divisive and militant Black Power approach, advocating for broader changes to American society. The embrace of a more divisive stance came due to their belief that equity for African Americans would require more than just equality before the law, but also fundamental changes to American society. The dissension of Black activism after 1965 was also a reflection of the divisiveness that was growing in American society writ large. President Kennedy had been a popular president, receiving support from Americans from a variety of backgrounds. JFK, or Jack as he was called, was young, attractive, and fashionable. He and his wife, Jackie, were a powerful couple, the first presidential pairing to also be considered celebrities, and they helped to craft the image of American Camelot during the Kennedy presidency, wherein the Kennedys were American royals. Kennedy may have struggled with foreign policy at the beginning of his administration, but he did give some support to the civil rights movement, seeing it as a moral good and a way to unite America, and his foreign policy skills improved over time as well. Kennedy also did much to bolster the nation's reputation across the world, especially with newly independent former colonial African nations. Kennedy's New Frontier domestic economic policy, which had echoes of the New Deal, called for increased economic spending to help the poor, and helped to get the country out of a recession that had gone on since the late 50s. Kennedy also intensified the space race, promising that the U.S. would put a man on the moon by the end of the 1960s through NASA's Apollo space program. The U.S. would fulfill this goal during Neil Armstrong's Apollo 11 spacewalk on July 20, 1969. One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. All of the optimism of the Kennedy years faded away on 11/22/1963. Kennedy was touring Dallas, Texas in the back of a convertible when he was shot by a sniper hiding in the Texas schoolbook depository. The gunman, Lee Harvey Oswald, was arrested shortly thereafter. Oswald, a former Marine, had spent time in the USSR and had adopted communist political leanings. Oswald was also probably mentally ill as well. Oswald had tried to assassinate other political figures in the past and had an extensive rap sheet as well, but the FBI generally ignored him. Oswald managed to fire 3 rounds from his rifle, striking Kennedy and Texas Governor John Connally as well. Kennedy was pronounced dead at a local hospital about half an hour later. Kennedy's assassination was a traumatic event for Americans. Even Walter Cronkite, the steely television journalist, broke down in tears when he reported Kennedy's death. Kennedy's assassination had the same effect on Americans that Pearl Harbor had in 1941, and 9/11 would have almost 40 years later. The Dallas police eventually caught up with Oswald and arrested him, but Oswald was killed by Jack Ruby, a local nightclub owner with ties to the criminal underground, before Oswald could be tried in court. The mysterious circumstances around JFK's death, combined with Oswald's killing, led many people to believe that Kennedy had been assassinated as part of a conspiracy, either by the Soviets or domestic enemies. A commission led by Chief Justice Earl Warren ultimately concluded that Oswald had acted alone. Still, Americans wanted to believe that Kennedy had been murdered as part of a scheme to deal with the trauma of his death. Many Americans believe in this conspiracy theory, even today. After Kennedy's death, Lyndon B. Johnson, the vice president, was sworn into the presidency. LBJ planned to continue many of Kennedy's policies, including advancing civil rights, fighting the war on poverty, and escalating the war in Vietnam. Johnson helped to end the filibuster over the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The act received more support from the Republicans than the Democrats, but Johnson worried that the South would stop voting Democrat and start voting Republican because of his party's support of the act, and because Republican presidential candidate Senator Barry Goldwater of Arizona opposed the act in the 1964 election. Goldwater, the first major U.S. presidential candidate of Jewish descent, had voted in favor of the 1957 Civil Rights Act. He had rejected the 1964 Act, not because he was a supporter of segregation, but because he thought the act was a form of government overreach. Goldwater ran against Johnson in the 1964 election, but lost in a landslide. Johnson's campaign played up Goldwater's refusal to vote for the Civil Rights Act. They also argued that Goldwater's aggressive stance against the Soviet Union would lead to nuclear Armageddon. Goldwater won Arizona and a handful of Deep South states. Johnson, conversely, won everything else, running on the promise of bringing a Great Society welfare program, which had echoes of the New Deal in it. Johnson hoped that the Great Society programs would be his legacy. Unfortunately for him, he would be remembered for something else. Johnson is perhaps most remembered for escalating the Vietnam War by sending U.S. combat troops to fight against the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong. Johnson used attacks on U.S. naval vessels off the coast of Vietnam as a pretext for beginning open war against North Vietnam, and the deployment of troops who would face the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong in a direct, non-advisory role. JFK, Johnson's predecessor, had been concerned that capitalist South Vietnam and its military, the ARVN, were losing the war against the Viet Cong and the communist North Vietnamese army. JFK believed in domino theory and feared that the fall of Vietnam would lead to the spread of communism all across Southeast Asia. The South Vietnamese government was ruled by a corrupt president, Diem, who had little regard for the South Vietnamese people. The war between the South and the North had been brutal, with atrocities committed by both sides. After Diem's assassination and a military coup in 1963, things went from bad to worse, and many believed that South Vietnam's defeat and absorption into communist North Vietnam would be imminent without additional U.S. support. U.S. ground troops did not arrive until March of 1965, and the U.S. public initially supported the deployment. The U.S. strategy was to use overwhelming force and strategic strikes, search and destroy, to defeat the Viet Cong insurgency and the organized NVA. The U.S. and its allies' goal would be to retake major population centers and kill or incapacitate as many enemies as possible in rural areas. The North Vietnamese were supported by the USSR and China, and the U.S. received assistance from Australia, New Zealand, and South Korea, among other countries, who lent troops to the U.S. and South Vietnam in their fight against the North. The U.S. strategy consisted of sending patrols, often by helicopters, into the Vietnamese countryside to root out the NVA and the VC, and also to fortify and consolidate villages, what was called the Strategic Hamlet Program. The progress of the war would be measured in the body count and the assumed demoralization of the VC and NVA, while casualty figures had been important in previous full-scale wars. Americans had been able to measure their military success more through the capture of territory. The conflict or police action in Vietnam arguably had more in common with the Indian Wars in the 19th century or the US-Philippines conflict than it did with the more recent World and Korean Wars, because of the attrition-based nature of the fighting. Like the US-Philippines War, the Vietnam War would have a major counterinsurgency component, and like the Indian Wars, American strategy would use irregular warfare to destroy North Vietnamese economic targets in order to force the NVA and the VC to its knees. Keep in mind, though, that the technology used in warfighting had advanced greatly since the 19th century and early 20th century. The US military had jet aircraft, helicopters, and napalm bombs, and its ground troops were issued automatic M14 and M16 rifles. Additionally, embedded journalists with camera equipment and the ability to inform the American public about the progress of the war, or lack thereof, every day through the television as well. The US government did not censor the press during the Vietnam conflict in the same way that it had during the First and Second World Wars, allowing more information about the war to become public, especially negative info. While Americans had initially supported the escalation of the Vietnam War and the deployment of ground troops, public opinion of the war collapsed with each passing year, and Johnson abandoned his re-election hopes in 1968, believing he would lose. In addition, the U.S. Army, who provided the bulk of the troops, relied on conscripts who had been drafted for a service of 1 year. Most draftees did not want to be in Vietnam, and because of their brief deployment tours, left the service just as they were beginning to gain combat experience. In addition, many of the African American draftees connected their conscription in the U.S. war on Vietnam with the racial unrest going on stateside, feeding into the rhetoric of the Black Power movement. U.S. morale, both among the military and at home, plummeted in 1968 in response to the Tet Offensive. In late January and February of 1968, the NVA and the VC began a massive offensive in South Vietnam to coincide with the Japanese New Year, Tet. The NVA/VC coalition made attacks as far south as Saigon, even attacking the U.S. embassy there in the South Vietnamese capital. It would take over a month for the U.S. and ARVN to push the NVA and the VC back. Over 4,000 U.S. soldiers were killed in the Tet Offensive, and although the offensive ended with the North Vietnamese withdrawal and tactical victory for the U.S., it was a strategic loss for America, as support for the war fell and the media condemned the bloodshed. Desertions of stateside troops went up significantly, along with protests against the war. The My Lai Massacre happened in March of 1968, right on the heels of the Tet Offensive. In this event, U.S. soldiers had killed over 300 Vietnamese villagers, most of whom had no ties to the Viet Cong insurgency. The massacre and the U.S. Army's attempted cover-up only emboldened anti-war activists. Subsequent investigations suggested the U.S. military's counterinsurgency and irregular warfare strategy, combined with the racism that many American GIs had for the Vietnamese, were major contributing factors in the massacre. Onto the chaos the U.S. was facing because of race riots and the unpopular war in Vietnam, Republican President Richard Nixon promised to fix the nation's problems. Nixon promised to bring law and order and end the protests and riots in major cities, even the ones that occurred outside the Democratic National Convention in Chicago. Nixon had attempted to reach out to Southern conservative voters, beginning a Southern strategy, since the Democratic candidate Hubert Humphrey had come out in support of civil rights legislation. At the same time, Nixon claimed he supported civil rights, although he opposed the busing of mostly black inner-city students to mostly white suburban schools. The Southern strategy helped Nixon gain support in the Upper South, but most of the Deep South would vote for independent, segregationist candidate George Wallace. Nixon had promised that he had a secret plan to end the Vietnam War, which appealed to Americans from a variety of perspectives. In the end, Nixon won the 1968 election handily, gaining a plurality of the popular vote and taking over 301 electoral votes. After his election, Nixon began his strategy of Vietnamization, in which the U.S. would remove its combat troops from Vietnam and leave the fighting on the ground to the ARVN. Advisors would remain in Vietnam and help ARVN, and the U.S. Air Force would increase its strategic bombing of targets in North Vietnam, as well as targets in Laos and Cambodia, although Nixon had promised to win the war in Vietnam. He had really only minimized the number of boots on the ground for the U.S. The war would continue until 1975, but we'll talk more about the Vietnam War in the next video. Well, the 1960s had started off optimistically, with successes in the struggle for black civil rights and the popularity of JFK's presidency. This optimism would be replaced by chaos and division as a result of the assassination of JFK. The race riots in the wake of the civil rights movement and the increasingly unpopular Vietnam War caused the U.S. government to struggle. While the U.S. government had effectively encouraged conformity and unity in the 1950s, the toll these events took on the American public shattered the confidence that many Americans had, both in their nation and its culture. The counterculture movement manifested itself in many aspects of American life. Counterculture helped to inspire major changes to American culture, especially those surrounding conceptions of the American dream. Counterculture supporters condemned the American dream so long as it encouraged conformity, respect for authority, and consumerism. Instead, counterculture proponents encouraged Americans to tune on, turn in, and drop out, often with the aid of psychedelic drugs. Groups like the hippies encouraged drug use and rejected post-World War II American consumerism, emphasizing a life instead based around travel, music, art, and drug use to bring out people's inner creativity. Many baby boomers who came of age in the 1960s bought into these movements, enjoying the new styles and perspectives they brought, while also listening to new rock and roll music. The Beatles, a British rock band, would become especially popular in the U.S., particularly with young women. Young Americans traveled around the country, congregating in counterculture centers like San Francisco in 1967, and at music festivals like Woodstock in New York in 1969. Hippies and other counterculture aficionados questioned the contemporary gender and sexuality norms, and thanks to technological advancements like the birth control pill, encouraged promiscuity, free love, and the sexual revolution. The hippies and people like them also adopted more casual clothing styles and sought to express individual creativity through designs like tie-dyeing. Jeans and t-shirts began to replace suits as daily wear among young Americans. Men also grew out their hair in protest of post-war masculinity in the Vietnam War. Corporations looking to profit began marketing products to the hippies, even as they spurned capitalist consumerism, and what some scholars have called the conquest of cool. While many people joined the hippies and countercultural movements as a whole, many others, especially religious people and older generations, criticized young people for rejecting what were deemed to be traditional American values: hard work, patriotism, and sacrifice for one's country. The young people who opposed the war in Vietnam were often accused of a lack of patriotism by the older generations. In recent years, scholars on both the right and the left have criticized the hippies and many people in the countercultural movement for their hypocrisy. They did this because they felt that many hippies had bought into consumerism, the very thing they claimed to be against, and they criticized these people for their self-indulgence, believing that they focused too much on recreation instead of activism. Although some still praise them for their questioning of American social norms. Despite the counterculture movement's controversial nature and message, and the supposed sins of its adherents, countercultural ideas would become mainstream within American politics, culture, and society in the years following the 1960s. In the end, the 1960s ended in a very different place than they started. The early 1960s had been a time that encouraged conformity, and even as the American political structure changed in the fight for black civil rights, people believed the core elements of American life should not change. All of this went out the window with the assassination of JFK and the escalation of the Vietnam War. To many observers, America had lost its innocence, and division replaced unity. The civil rights struggle was eclipsed by the more militant Black Power movement, and Americans protested for the causes they supported, often violently across the country. The unity and consensus of 1960 was all but gone by 1969.